As we get set for this fireside chat, I'd once again like to encourage all our viewers to please send in questions for our speakers, and I'm sure they'll only be happy to address the same. We're now all set to begin our fireside on preventing sexual harassment at workplace, where we bring together practice leads to talk through the strategies, their experiences, and their organizations. So let us extend a very warm welcome to Ms. Shalini Prasad, Senior Director, HR, Qualcomm, India. A very warm welcome to you. May I also present to you Ms. Pooja Ramachandani, partner, Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. And may I also extend a very warm welcome to our moderator, Mr. Rahool S. Panandiker, Managing Director and Partner, BCG India. And let's look forward to this very interesting session.
Thank you, Isha. And welcome all to this very seminal session and a very pertinent one, and one that is so critical when we are broadly talking about the topic of diversity and inclusion. I mean, it's pretty well known that an organization that really promotes a culture of diversity and inclusion likely will have also a very low incidence of sexual harassment as well. And probably the converse is true as well. When you see sexual harassment, probably as a symptom of the fact that diversity and inclusion in some way or form have been compromised. To discuss more on this topic, we have, I guess, two very eminent panelists, Shalini and Pooja. But before we get into what organizations are doing, what does this culture of creating an inclusive environment by preventing sexual harassment mean, just want to set the stage right. And I'll call on Pooja to just take us through, in some ways, I guess, the 101 on what exactly constitutes sexual harassment from a legal perspective or even a social perspective.
Thank you, Rahul, and good morning to everybody. So I'll just jump right into it. There's no straitjacket formula to determine what constitutes sexual harassment, and which is the reason why the term has been given a very wide import under the POSH Act, and it's an inclusive definition of sorts. So the definition says that how any physical contact or advances, demand or request for sexual favors, making sexually colored remarks, showing pornography, any other unwelcome physical, verbal or non-verbal conduct of sexual nature could be sexual harassment. But what one needs to understand is that the key factors that constitute sexual harassment is that the act needs to be unwelcome, and it can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be non-verbal, and it needs to have a sexual innuendo or a sexual nature or connotation to it. Now, such conduct coupled with preferential treatment or detrimental treatment or humiliating treatment or intimidating or offensive or hostile work environment or even a threat to employment can constitute sexual harassment in a workplace. So the courts have, set out several judicial precedents where the question of what is sexual harassment has been discussed. And some of these judicial proceedings set out that, when determining what is sexual harassment, what's important is to look at the incident holistically as a whole and not in isolation. The surrounding facts and circumstances are very critical. What is a very important factor is to understand what is the reasonable woman standard. By that, what I mean is that how does a recipient of a conduct is perceiving the conduct to be. It's not about intent. It's about the victim's perception of a particular act. So harassment has to be seen from a victim's perspective. So a conduct that many people might find, very normal and not unobjectionable could be offensive for certain people. The other aspect that one needs to keep in mind is that when we're looking at sexual harassment, as I said, it's not verbal, it's not non-verbal, it can be physical, it can be verbal. So there could be instances where, touching someone may not necessarily be sexual harassment when there is no sexual innuendo to it. At the same time, not touching someone could also mean sexual harassment depending on, the demeanor of the person. So, to sum it all, sexual harassment has a very wide connotation under the law, and one has to look at things objectively, and one has to look at, what are the facts and circumstances that are in front of you, and accordingly, determine what is the impact and what has happened really in a case.
Thanks, Pooja. This is really helpful. I think you really put it out as to how nuanced this discussion and context really means and all the elements that go through it. At one end, it's very objective. At the other end, there's a lot of contextual elements that also can contribute. And I think you really put it well that it could be and it could not be around the same circumstance in many different situations. So really happy to hear that. Let me turn to Shalini. And the basic precept of this conference in some ways, diversity and inclusion. How do you see policies associated with the prevention of sexual harassment, all the elements, I guess, of the cultural elements that an organization are doing these days, and yours for sure pioneering in this? What are we doing so that this element in some way contributes to creating the positive environment promoting diversity and inclusion?
Thank you, Rahul, and good morning, everybody. I think diversity is a key agenda, a key enabler, and it's an approach to business that unites ethical management and high performance. Business leaders in the global economy really recognize the benefits of a diverse workforce and see it as an organizational strength. So they recognize that diversity can enhance performance and drive innovation. Now, gender diversity being minority, policies like POSH help establish a safe workplace. So via policy, we are able to enlist not only behaviors that are acceptable, but also talks about the redressal mechanisms. This helps create equity for women by driving right behaviors and being constituents of the governance and compliance. It enables gender balance, creates a safe and equitable workplace. And in my view, this is not just a policy. Rather, it enables organizations to do the right thing.
Thanks, Shalini. Really well put, very succinctly. It's something that we must do. It's not just anymore a choice. And it's part and parcel of what I think understanding the value of diversity and inclusion and how this can actually contribute to that. Thank you so much. When we really look around, one, there's a lot of quote unquote noise that happens around the whole topic of sexual harassment. I really appreciate, Pooja, how you've really brought it down and get us to understand it. But there's a lot of myths as well. What exactly constitutes sexual harassment? Where does it apply? Where does it not apply? Is it about gender? Is it about power? Is it about hierarchy? Does it happen both ways? So what are these things, if I were to ask Pooja, what are some of these myths that you hear when you're dealing with some of these cases, when something comes up to you that are sort of myths, and what's the reality actually when it comes to sexual harassment?
You're absolutely right, Rahul. There are many misconceptions when it comes to right from the applicability of the Act to the compliances under the Act and on, what is sexual harassment and what's not. I touched upon, what could or could not be sexual harassment. So I'll go into some of the others. One of the things that we have come across is that, a company which basically has male employees, there is a myth that there's no requirement of a policy or a committee. Now that is absolutely incorrect, because what the law says is that you need to have 10 employees. The minute you have 10 employees, you need to put in place a committee. The policy under the Act which is necessary to put in place does not even go on the number. You need to have a policy in place. And the reason why this is the case is because when you look at the law talks of sexual harassment of women at workplace, and the definition of an aggrieved woman is wide enough to even include those who may not be employed at that particular workplace, but also those who may be visiting the workplace. So therefore, this is a complete myth that there are many organizations and factories and manufacturing setups where it's male dominated, and you don't need to have a policy or an IC in place. So that's absolutely wrong. The other one is something that you just said, that genders, whether sexual harassment is a gender neutral. It's not only men can be harassers. The obvious answer is that is untrue, right? Harassers could be anyone. It doesn't depend on the gender, obviously. In fact, there's a recent case of the Calcutta High Court in the year 2020 where the harasser there itself was the same gender. So the court has recognized the fact that the respondent or the harasser could be any gender, and the law does not prohibit looking into a case where the respondent is of the same gender. So that's another aspect of where there is a myth. And when you look at the definition of sexual harassment being so wide, another myth that has goes around is that it's only physical touch that can lead to sexual harassment. And as I just explained, it's not just about physical touch. It could be much wider than that. Some other aspects is that sexual harassment has to occur in a physical workplace. So here again, it's important to understand that workplace, as defined under the Act, again has a very wide connotation, and it's not just the office that you go to. Workplace extends to your home even. It extends to hotels, restaurants, office get-togethers, parties, etc. All of that is workplace. In fact, in the last couple of years, when most of us have been working from home, there have been a lot of instances of sexual harassment, even like on a virtual medium. So that's another myth that sexual harassment can only happen at a workplace. The minute you step out, it cannot be construed as sexual harassment, at least for the purposes of the Act. And another aspect again, which I'm probably might be repeating over here, is about intent. Now many a times in relationships, there are consensual relationships, or there are someone professing love, etc. Now intent is never a relevant objective of determining whether there is an act of sexual harassment. It's the reasonable woman standard which needs to be applied. It is the victim or the recipient, how that person perceives, is what needs to be applied. So these are some of the myths on sexual harassment that we have come across and experienced and been asked questions on. Some other aspects also lead to the constitution of the internal committee. Do you need one at each each establishment? Can we have common committees? So there are permutation combinations that the law provides for. The idea and intent, of course, of the law being to provide for a safe working environment for no matter the gender. Of course, the POSH Act protects women, but as we all know that there is a new act called the Transgender Protection of Rights Act, which also now a lot of organizations are looking at putting in place several welfare measures and creating an enabling and protecting environment for transgender employees.
So, I think you've really helped us think through, and there is obviously, as you've mentioned, a lot of myths going around. But, I guess when the act of sexual harassment happens, I think we really can get into, as you pointed out, committees and all other redressal measures. Let me turn to Shalini and see what is it that organizations are doing just in terms of sensitizing people. What is it that they can do, or what are organizations doing to just prevent unprofessional behavior? I'm trying to put it loosely, I guess. So what is it that organizations in your mind are doing, and where do you think we stand right now in India? Are we ahead of the curve? Are we catching up? What's going on in your mind with organizations?
I think, Rahul, very pertinent points that Pooja just shared, that it's not about the intent, it's about how the person who went through it felt. I think that matters more than anything else. And I think this unprofessional behavior is sometimes all permeable. I mean, it's all across. So handling it in office can take some effort, but it's necessary in my view. If we want to avoid a chaotic work environment, we need to have policies and guidelines in place. And it actually sets a very bad precedence in workplaces. It causes conflicts. Eventually, it impacts performance. So I think the earlier we address this behavior, the better it is for the organization. Some of the stuff that is there as part of the unprofessional behavior, which is visible probably in organizations across sometimes, is intimidating or bullying or sexual harassment, dominating meetings, refusal to work, and then aggressiveness, etc. So I think it's an organization, all of us have to look at it, that it's important to have guidelines, policies, reiterate these priorities to the organization. And on one hand, we have these policies, we tell all these employees about all this, we let the employees know that this will not be tolerated. Employers, employees should all respond to incidences of unprofessional behavior, including harassment, and raise it. But on the other hand, these policies are definitely needed to set forth a detailed mechanism by which employees know that they can make a complaint, there is a process around it, and that if there is a situation like this, there will be somebody looking into it. And that confidence is important, because if I make a complaint and my complaint is not going to be looked into seriously, and I believe that my manager or supervisor or the top level executive is going to just brush it aside, thinking, oh, this person is just thinking of it like this. It actually, it wasn't meant to be like that. I think those things really undermine it. So it's important that we investigate all complaints from employees like this. And I think at our company, it is taken very, very seriously. In my view, that if an employee feels confident that the company will handle it, they are likely to report it. Otherwise, we see attrition happening. Also, it's important to communicate it very, very clearly that, we have a zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. It should be very clearly articulated that we don't tolerate this. And I think to the question that you asked, that, whether we as organizations are, ahead of the curve or in, part of the curve, I think we are evolving. I think as we go through this development of how organizations are moving, we are evolving as a industry. I do think that the pandemic has created another way of another situation where all of this had to be looked into, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well, as to how do we handle this into the virtual environment, because initially it's all meant to be in physical environment in the office, but actually most organizations have very quickly adapted all their policies to how to ensure that all of these behaviors are definitely avoided, and enough awareness campaigns are done, enough training is done to ensure that people in the virtual work environment also feel safe.
Shalini, I think it's an excellent point you're making in saying that it is an evolving space. Organizations also are learning. The workplace has changed. I think, as Pooja mentioned, it's no more just sitting in the office. The definitions evolve as is expected. Law has to keep up with it. Policies have to keep up with it. And you brought up a point in the end, which I really want to probe a little bit more. So once you get into the situation of sexual harassment, there seems to be at least a large number of organizations, especially the large ones, have put in place policies, committees, redressal mechanisms. Some are working on the culture of it. You brought up a point on training.
Right.
And I'll throw this open to both of you, because you both represent very large, very progressive organizations. What is the role that training is playing for you in this whole area of prevention of sexual harassment? And what kind of trainings are you talking about? Are they structured, unstructured? Is it at what levels? Is it internal, external? What's going on with the trainings? And I call that as a broader part of sensitization, making sure everyone understands the gravity, the severity, the understanding, the common vocabulary, all that sort of stuff. So maybe I'll ask Pooja first, and then maybe Shalini, you can also give a point of view.
Absolutely.
So, yes, Rahul. So I believe that training happens at 3 levels. The law prescribes that you must have sensitization workshops for employees and training workshops for your internal committees. These 2 are mandatorily required training sessions, which also need to be disclosed in the annual report and reported to the authorities under the POSH Act. However, in my view, it's also important, and many organizations also do conduct training for its management. Now, the reason why this is important is that it's important for the management to know how crucial a sexual harassment proceeding or complaint going wrong can impact an organization, and which is why the management needs to know how do you what's the importance of this, how do you deal with sexual harassment issues, what can go wrong, and it can bring about reputational damage, financial issues, financial risks, right? When things go right, then you land up in court, and a lot of things can go wrong during the whole process. And I'm sure we've all seen and that how things can go wrong in sexual harassment cases, where things can just get prolonged, protracted. There are issues in terms of wrongful complaints, malicious complaints, there is victimization, etc. So how do you manage this? At the end of the day, it is a risk management where management needs to know of and understand. In terms of what all goes into these trainings, and I won't take too much of time because I'm sure Chalini also has her things to add from her perspective. So for employees, essentially, it's, what constitutes sexual harassment, who can file the complaint, what's the redressal mechanism. They need to know about how they have a confidentiality obligation, there should be no retaliation or victimization, etc. For the ICs, it is more about, the process, principles of natural justice, adhering to timelines, and so on and so forth.
Shalini, if I may just ask you to add, what is it that you do in your organization with regard to training and sensitization?
Absolutely, and Rahul, thank you for that. And as Pooja said, I think those are exactly the guidelines or the framework in which we also operate. I think Qualcomm's really been successful in creating an inspiring and inclusive workplace where employees feel valued, supported. So we practice, zero tolerance policy towards any forms of harassment and emphasize importance of raising these concerns by reinforcing policies that are driving safe workplace and actually prohibiting any kind of harassment, even in the virtual work model. So how do we do this? One, of course, there is a web-based module that our employees also go through. This module, everybody goes through every year, literally. It used to be training where we used to just talk about physical work environment, but now, of course, it's all virtual as well. In the hybrid work environment, what constitutes harassment, sexual harassment? What are the do's and don'ts that one needs to practice? So that's the key. That's the basic thing that everybody needs to go through. However, at different levels of employees, it is important to talk about, right? So when employees join the organization, right at the time when we are onboarding, at that place itself, we are at that point of time training people on what is Qualcomm's Code of Business Conduct, and it covers the overview of POSH. Then promoting, how do we promote a harassment-free work environment? If they have a concern, where do they go? What do they do? Who can they really raise the concern to? And from the line manager's perspective, people who are people managers, it is important that we help them understand, how do they need to hear out somebody if somebody comes to them and talks about a harassment that they've faced, or and then we need to help the managers understand where is it that they will notify. Also, it is extremely important at that point of time that the line managers, like Pooja said, help the employee understand that it is kept completely confidential, so that there is confidence built in the person that if they are raising a concern, it won't lead to any kind of retaliation. For senior leaders, we partner with legal teams, so that there is training conducted for them, and we can provide all clarifications, statutory legal implications if there is a violation, so that there is enough awareness and people understand that at the very leadership level that it is important, it is critical, and it is not a negotiable thing at all. And then also, while we do all this, I think the most important piece always is to help the women employees feel confident that they can raise concerns. We at our company did many speak-up sessions. It's like a regular feature where employees are given opportunities to understand, how to speak up, and if they need any help, where to go. We've done a lot of panel discussions as well with women employees, which were hosted by ex-POSH committee members or senior leadership, HR, who faced some of these similar situations and investigated them. So how can they talk about what happens in an investigation, so that it builds that confidence in people, and they then realize that if there is harassment, if there is a harassment that one has faced, one shouldn't never ever let it lie down. You have to raise it. You have to bring it out in the open, and raise it to the right people, raise it to the POSH committee, so that it can be looked into. The most important thing, I think, through all of these trainings is that awareness that we always want to create.
Awareness way better than prevention later on, as a more important part of prevention. Really, thank you so much, both of you, for a rich set of almost best practices that could be applied across many different organizations and institutions and entities. I want to put you both on the spot here. We always talk about best practices. Let me ask both of you, based on your experience, based on your conversations with your peers and the broader understanding, Pooja, of what turns up at your plate sometimes professionally, how well are we doing as a country on this whole topic of building awareness and preventing sexual harassment?
Well, in my view, I think we are still evolving there. And given the number of cases that we see which are being filed, not only before the court, but before the Women's Commission, etc., we are still evolving.
Okay.
And mindset change that I think needs to take place, number one. And number two, what is more important that I've been seeing in the last few years is how this mechanism has been taken an advantage of. So that sort of puts a lot of people in the back foot. And, so that's something which one needs to also consider and address.
Shalini, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think from the time the POSH Act came into place, I think there's been a lot of work that the companies have done. If you look around, companies would have definitely made efforts to ensure that we are all compliant with all the Act requirements. There are internal complaints committees, there are trainings, all of that happens across for all organizations. I'm sure we're doing all this. But has that led to zero harassment, and has that led to a situation where it is completely sexual harassment free? I don't think so. I think this is a slightly wider cultural piece that we probably need to address at some point of time, not just in the organization. I think we are all responsible for what happens in the organization, but the upbringing and the cultural environment in which you are sometimes probably doesn't help. So I think that's probably the topic for discussion another time. But I think for this discussion, I would say that yes, I think companies are all making right efforts. They are spreading awareness. They are helping women employees speak up, and they are all providing avenues, ensuring there is zero retaliation, ensuring that fair investigation happens. All of that is being ensured. But I do think that there is some way to go in this.
And I think you've made a very interesting point. While we're tackling the issue at the organizational level, this is a broader ethos of society. I think Pooja mentioned the right word, the mindset that has to change over time for us to really get to where we want to be. But I want to get to something a little bit more of the nitty-gritty details, Shalini, and you were referring to it already. So, we know these instances happen. Pooja has mentioned, it goes all the way up to the top and legal situations and all that. What does one do? What exactly is this process of forming a committee? How does it work? Just a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the process.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we at Qualcomm take law as the backbone, and as defined in the statutory requirements, we've also constituted an internal complaints committee that looks into it, that investigates such incidents as reported. Senior leaders from various functions like HR, engineering, other functions, including legal across the region, are part of the committee. And along with, we also have an external non-governmental organization member to ensure there is fairness in the entire process. All the committee members in our company are, trained, and every year we go through this refresher of the training so that this investigation happens in a safe and confidential manner. And also, not just what is prescribed, but just to ensure that there is no unconscious bias coming in. We ensure that, that the investigating team that is looking into any POSH issue does not have any working relationship with the parties involved. Now, this essentially just makes sure that people, get an environment where they are able to share their views without fear of retaliation, or without fearing that, oh, this person knows my supervisor, or knows this person, or knows that person, and therefore there could be some kind of an aftermath of this. So I think that also is something that we are very, very particular about, and as much as possible we ensure that this safe environment is created so that people can speak up there without inhibitions, and neutral perspectives are therefore shared. Also, we are, as a process, it's important that this committee safeguards the privacy of the employees, and therefore confidentiality through this entire process, and neutrality. I think the two most important things that we as an organization take care of.
Thanks so much, Shalini. Let me just we have 2 minutes, one last question to Pooja. We know there's a committee. In your mind, is there a recommended composition to the committee? Do you find that creating a diversity in the roles of that committee, bringing in people from the outside who can represent social ethos, a social worker, do you think there's a role for that in such committees? Or what do you think is the right format and composition of a committee for POSH?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Rahul. Social worker is, in fact, one of the mandates of the law. Like as Shalini just mentioned, they have a member of an NGO. So what the law says is that there is a requirement of an external member, essentially to ensure independence of the committee. This external member can either be from an NGO or a social worker or someone familiar with the issues of sexual harassment. So someone who has the expertise in handling cases of sexual harassment is a social worker, would definitely add value to a committee.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. Isha, I don't know if there's any questions. I think we have a minute to go. You're on mute, but I'm hearing you with the nod that it means there is no questions. So then let me thank Shalini and Pooja for such an engaged session in allowing us to understand this whole topic of one, sexual harassment, prevention of sexual harassment, what companies are doing, and how important it is to in the broader promotion of diversity and inclusion in organization and society at large. Thank you so much. I'll draw this to a close.